to succeed by their wits. One of them was this man, Denis Diderot. Unlike Voltaire, Diderot wasn't a member of the aristocratic elite. His great work was France's first encyclopedia, the engine of the Enlightenment. But he'd barely begun when another of his works was noticed by the king's censors.
1749 fand sich Diderot in einer Zelle im Château de Vincennes, vielleicht in dieser. Er hatte es gewagt, ein Buch zu schreiben, in dem er behauptete, Wissen käme von den Sinnen, nicht aus göttlicher Offenbarung. Für den König war das Provokation genug, um ihn hier festzusetzen. Obwohl Diderot im Hochsommer festgenommen wurde, brachte ihm sein Kerkermeister jeden Tag 2 Kerzen. Nach einigen Tagen sagte er dem Kerkermeister, er könne sie wieder mitnehmen, er brauche das nicht, das Licht sei gut, es sei Sommer. Aber der Kerkermeister sagte ihm, behalte sie, du wirst sie vielleicht während der langen Winterabende brauchen. Erst da wurde ihm klar, dass er hier vielleicht saß für Monate, Jahre, je nachdem, wie lange der König ihn behalten wollte.
But the worst thing about imprisonment for Diderot was that it was keeping him from the great project of his life, the Encyclopédie, which he'd barely begun when he was thrown into jail. His idea was to bring together the finest minds of the day and produce a series of books that would include not only philosophy and ideas, but also craft and trade skills, explained in every detail. Until then, useful knowledge like this hadn't been thought worth recording. But Diderot and his colleagues sought out the ordinary people, to whom nobody had previously listened.
Die Behandlung der handwerklichen Tätigkeiten selbst war ein Programm der Enzyklopädie. Es hat die Handwerke sehr aufgewertet in einer Zeit, in der eigentlich nur Aristokraten einen Wert hatten. Und das kommt natürlich auch daher, Diderot kam aus Langres, also eigentlich aus der Provinz, aus der Champagne. Und da war sein Vater ein Messerschmied, der hat Klingen geschmiedet und war sehr gut in seinem Beruf, wollte eigentlich auch, dass sein Sohn ihm nachfolgt. Aber er hat es eine Woche lang probiert und er hat es wirklich nicht gewollt und er hat es wirklich nicht gekonnt. Aber er war stolz auf seinen Vater. Er war stolz auf das Handwerk, er war stolz darauf, dass jemand etwas mit seinen Händen produzierte. Und das ist natürlich auch genau das Gegenteil von den Priestern und Aristokraten, die Frankreich tatsächlich beherrschten.
Even imprisonment didn't discourage Diderot as he planned his encyclopédie, nor did it tone down his radical intentions. But he realized it would outrage the authorities, especially the church.
Sie durften nicht zu subversiv sein. Man muss sich erinnern, damals wurden Menschen nicht nur eingesperrt für das, was sie sagten, sie wurden tatsächlich auch noch hingerichtet, manchmal wahnsinnig grausam hingerichtet.
With the stakes this high, Diderot had to be ingenious in outwitting the censors.
Hier zum Beispiel ist das Système de Connaissance, also eigentlich das System des ganzen Wissens. Und wenn Sie sich das ansehen, dann sehen Sie, ganz oben ist die Theologie. Das haben die Zensoren sicherlich gemocht.
But right below religion is black magic. Even the sequence of entries in his encyclopédie held hidden meaning. His world had no place for belief in any god at all. He hid his attacks on the church throughout the whole work, even in a system of cross-references, like one which links the Eucharist with cannibalism. His wit and daring attracted friends as well as enemies, and luckily for Diderot, they included the king's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. She was even painted with her own copy of the Encyclopédie. With such friends in high places, after 3 months in prison, Diderot was released. the king and the censors had realized that Diderot's great project had become an industry in itself, and potentially a very profitable one. Despite continuing harassment from the church, Diderot and his colleagues were consumed for the next 26 years in bringing their great work into being. There were 20 million words in 28 volumes, and every letter of every word had to be set by hand. Hundreds of typesetters, tanners, printers and bookbinders were involved.
Diderot hatte einen hohen Preis bezahlt für seine Arbeit an der Enzyklopädie. Er war 3 Monate eingesperrt gewesen, aber in 1751 konnte er sie endlich in seinen Händen halten. Da war der Tome Premier und es war ein gigantischer Erfolg. Und tatsächlich einerseits seine Inhaftierung und andererseits die Enzyklopädie selbst machten ihn zu einem berühmten Mann, erreichten also das, was er wollte. Er bekam einen Brief von Voltaire, der ihm gratulierte, der ihn den modernen Sokrates nannte.
Diderot's vast enterprise finally achieved his ambition, bringing respect and recognition to ordinary people. But most of them had little chance of reading about it.
The Encyclopédie was a very expensive book. It actually cost something like 980 livres, which, if you put that into the context of the time, a skilled artisan, if he was lucky, might earn something like 15 livres in a week. So he could never have afforded this. It was mostly bought by members of the social elite, the crème de la crème.
And even for those who could, buying any book remained a risky business.
Something like half the books that were published in France during the 18th century were banned books. They were sold under the counter secretly, and even the Encyclopédie was banned for a number of years. But Diderot said, a book banned is a book read.
Diderot realized that the controversy was helping to publicize the Encyclopédie. And despite the risks, its success started a huge boom in publishing at the time. The excitement of access to ideas, to information, to the wider world consumed society at all levels, as even ordinary people learned to read. Diderot's great dream of giving all knowledge to the world was becoming reality. But the Church was fighting back. Its supreme leader, the Pope, condemned the Encyclopédie and ordered it burned. He declared that any Catholic who dared to read it would face eternal damnation. Nowhere was the fight between enlightenment and religion harder than in Portugal. Here, the Enlightenment only prevailed through an unforeseeable event, a disaster which devastated the wealthy capital, and whose wider effects were to threaten the Church's authority throughout the world, right up to today. In the mid-18th century, Portugal was still the most religious place in Europe. Enlightenment ideas were barely known here. Even more than in France, the Catholic Church was in control. The priests told the people that sinners would be horribly punished by God after death. And a religious court called the Inquisition could condemn people to garrotting, beheading, or being burnt alive. It seemed that nothing could change the order of things, until one day in November 1755. The capital city, Lisbon, was mostly made up of narrow, crowded streets, all higgledy-piggledy on the shores of a big river. It teemed with a population of 250,000 people.
O dia 1 de novembro é um dia de Todos os Santos e é um dia feriado que naturalmente tem um especial significado nos países católicos. Portanto, no dia 1 de novembro de 1755, de manhã, toda a população de Lisboa acorria naturalmente às inúmeras igrejas e espaços religiosos. Perto das 10 da manhã, uma coisa terrível aconteceu e completamente inesperada. Ouviu-se um barulho tremendo e, de repente, as pessoas perceberam que a cidade estava a ruir à volta delas.
Lisbon was being struck by a massive earthquake.
E o terremoto atingiu uma escala de cerca de 9,1 na escala de Richter, desabou sobre Lisboa e, naturalmente, teve efeitos de uma destruição e de uma violência muitíssimo grandes.
As the city collapsed around them, some managed to escape the churches, only to be crushed in the streets by other falling buildings. Those who survived fled for their lives towards the river, only to see a huge tsunami bearing down on them. They drowned where they were. Then a wildfire swept through the city, adding to the carnage. Tens of thousands of people died that day. The people of Lisbon had done what the priests told them to. They had gone to church, they had prayed, but dreadful punishment had rained down on them anyway. They wanted to know why.
A Igreja dificilmente encontrava uma explicação lógica para que um Deus bom e omnipotente tivesse permitido que esta catástrofe acontecesse em Lisboa. Mas, efetivamente, a única coisa que a Igreja acabou por poder dizer era aconselhar as pessoas a rezar a Deus, a um Deus que tinha causado esta catástrofe.
One priest in particular rallied the people to repent, telling them that God had sent the earthquake, fire and tsunami as punishment for their sinfulness.
Gabriel Malagrida era padre jesuíta de origem italiana que se tinha já destacado e tinha adquirido uma espécie de estatuto místico como pregador na cidade de Lisboa. As suas pregações eram particularmente importantes e ouvidas com muita atenção. E convidava as pessoas apenas a rezar e não a ajudarem nos esforços de reconstrução da cidade.
But there were no churches to pray in. Most of them had been destroyed too. The earthquake also destroyed the faith of people hundreds of miles away. The church's inability to explain any of this sent shockwaves all over Europe. But there was one man who saw an opportunity in this disaster. The Marquis de Pombal was one of the few Portuguese who'd had access to the new ideas of the Enlightenment. Here at his once grand estate outside Lisbon, he began to plan to use these ideas to change the city and the lives of its people forever. For him, the earthquake was a chance to put those ideas into practice for the benefit of the whole population.
O Marquês de Pombal foi uma figura especial no nosso século XVIII. tinha sido ministro plenipotenciário, portanto o embaixador, primeiro em Londres e depois em Viena da Áustria, e essa experiência nessas duas capitais, num momento em que justamente a sociedade europeia estava a mudar, deu-lhe uma visão diferente daquilo que podia ser o futuro para Portugal.
Pombal wanted not just to rebuild the city, but to reinvent it. He had a vision of doing in stone and tile what Diderot had done in print, to bring the ordinary people into the Enlightenment and reduce the privilege of church and aristocracy. Pombal was the king's right-hand man, not an atheist like Diderot, nor a commoner like Newton. His plan was to use the king's power to get access to the church's wealth, not for himself, but for the people. But he faced a formidable challenge. The church and the king monopolized the power here and the wealth from Portugal's huge empire. The enormous palace and monastery of Mafra outside Lisbon has almost 900 rooms and took 45,000 men 13 years to build.
Mafra é bom exemplo desta partilha de poder entre o rei e a igreja. Por lado temos o Paço Real, onde o rei ficava, e do outro lado uma igreja, um convento, onde justamente os monges podiam rezar.
The monks also told the people to pray, and what to pray for.
Assim, por um lado, o rei considerava que vivia numa monarquia de origem divina e que, portanto, o seu poder tinha origem em Deus. Por outro lado, a Igreja garantia uma solução de proximidade relativamente às populações e que o povo obedecia a essa autoridade.
The monks who lived here enjoyed every luxury, ate off tables made from rare hardwoods cut by slaves, and walked on marble floors. Far from Lisbon, their monastery was untouched by the earthquake. Meanwhile, the people, always poor, were now homeless and starving. Pombal needed money to feed and house them. He persuaded the king that funding the rebuilding and modernizing of Lisbon would earn real loyalty from his people. He also realized that the skills he needed to build it were already at hand. The proof was in this aqueduct that brought fresh water from 60 kilometers away and stored it for the city. And it had withstood the earthquake.
Foi graças às suas águas que foi possível acorrer a duas necessidades imediatas. Foi possível prover às necessidades de água potável e também para combater o fogo que, como vimos, graçou por Lisboa e destruiu uma grande parte da cidade.
To Pombal, the aqueduct represented Newton's science put to practical use to provide a better life for the people. Pombal realized he could use the same skills to rebuild Lisbon. He'd replace the chaotic randomness of the old city with the geometric lines of classical architecture and incorporate the latest technologies. A new sewage system channeled away waste that had once flowed down the streets. The first ever anti-seismic structures protected against future earthquakes. And the urgent need to rehouse the homeless was answered by the world's first standardized building components. Every window, frame and balcony the same, so they could be made in quantity. He gave the city to the people of Lisbon for their own, a beautiful public place that belonged not to the church or the aristocracy, but to them.